ask you the question, who are you today? What would you say? Take a second and think about that. What does it mean? How does it relate to you? And really, what would you say? So, Hannah Dunn, who are you? A student? Okay. Alex, who are you?
Competitor.
He's a competitor. Miss Sutcliffe, who are you?
Mom.
A mom. Great. Those are all good answers. I feel like we've all been asked this question at one point or another in our lives, and typically those are my go-to answers as well. Normally I'd say, I'm a student, a friend, a sister, or an athlete. Now the funny thing is, if you ask someone else who is Libby, you may get a completely different answer. She's a thief is a common one, which for the record, I'm not, and we'll kind of touch on that later, or she's a leader on the student council. Whenever I think about these questions, my mind goes to my beliefs, actions, and personality, because I feel like these three things are pretty representative of who a person is. But of course, there's so many different ways to think about this, and we really could talk about it all day. Unfortunately, I'm only limited to 10 minutes with you today, so we can only talk about one of these topics. My favorite, personality. Now, I hope we all know a little bit about what our personalities are, but if not, they're just what separate everyone in this room. They're what make me, me, and you, you. Typically, they also show a little bit about someone's views and their ideas, which then other people use to judge and form an opinion of them on. A helpful tool we can use to classify our personalities is the OCEAN acronym, which stands for openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism, which is just emotional stability. Whenever I learned about this, I decided to take a personality test to see how I fit into these categories. I scored high in many of these categories except neuroticism, which was just medium. One really cool thing about our personality is much of our personality is actually inherited and engraved in our DNA. This means that whenever I was born, I had a set limit or idea of what my personality was going to be like. I will use the word limit lightly because our personalities are able to shift and evolve as we experience new things and change. So to show this, I'll give you a little example. Pretend I'm walking over here and hanging out with a group of people I'm not that familiar with. In this setting, I may act more introverted and be more closed off just because I'm not as comfortable with the people I'm around. The same is true for the opposite. If I'm over here hanging out with my friends, I will likely be more extroverted and maybe do some things I wouldn't do by myself. In both of these situations, I'm still me, but I'm a different version of myself. By understanding how our personalities can evolve and how we can classify them, we can get a better look at the question, who are you? Another way we can do this is by looking at different theories. So who here has siblings? Raise your hand. Most of us. And if you don't have siblings and you have a family or people you live with. One of the most interesting compliments I've ever received was, it's so funny how you and your family members all look exactly alike. It's like y'all are carbon copies of one another. And while I will admit we do look very similar, just because we look so similar doesn't mean we act similarly. In fact, there are times we couldn't be any more different. Alfred Adler, this renowned psychologist, made the birth order theory, which states that there are similarities between children of the same birth order sequence. You may have heard people say phrases like, the oldest is always so mature, or the middle child is easygoing and does whatever, or even the youngest is wild and can get away with anything. Whenever people say phrases like this, they're using the logic of Adler's birth order theory, whether they know it or not. So right now, I want you to take a second and think about these traits and if they fit you and your family members or your friends. For me, I feel like I do fit the characteristics of a middle child, but I also share the characteristics of the other traits. My middle child self shined when I went to Disney World for the first time with my whole extended family. Now, my family's pretty big. There's around 20 of us, and at this time, 9 of these people were kids under the age of 7. So I'm sure you can imagine how chaotic it was bringing all these little kids around Disney World who were so excited to ride the fun rides and see all the characters they grew up loving. In this setting, we went to all the kingdoms on this trip, and eventually we went to Animal Kingdom. And here I was getting pushed around in my little stroller, and all of a sudden I see this coming up in front of me. Obviously, that's a mountain, but to 3-year-old me from Baton Rouge, I had no idea what it was. So I had to ask my dad, and he told me it was this big kid ride that I was going to be too small to ride this time, and we'd have to go back later. Then he proceeded to talk to my older brother about how fun the ride was going to be and what it was going to be like on it. So in this setting, I felt like the middle child who was getting pulled either which way and had to be flexible because I was too little to go hang out with the big kids on the big kid ride, but too big to hang out with the little ones. Still, other times I can be a lot like the oldest child who might be more independent and look out for other people. So I'm the person who texted my advisor group chat and asks who's going to bring the food, which I'm sure they could all attest to. We went so far as to make a little plan on who would bring what when, just so we always have our Wednesday morning breakfast. Now, sometimes this does get messed up because we're all busy high schoolers, we have things to do. And one of these instances, I decided I'll surprise them and make muffins. So I made these muffins for my advisory so we could have breakfast to eat in the morning, and in little ways like this, but also other larger ones, I can be responsible and mature. Still, I have my times when my maturity can get the best of me and I can act a little more childish, and this is also where I could be considered a thief. So me and my friends have this game that I'm going to call Furnish the Yards, where we would drive around Baton Rouge looking for pieces of furniture people were throwing out like this, and then we would load them into our cars and bring them to one of our friends' houses and make a nice little display in their yards. Now, we thought this was really funny, and we kept doing it all summer, and eventually I went out of town. And when I got back in town, I saw this in my own yard. Now, my mom, she didn't know anything about this game we played. So whenever she saw this in my yard, obviously she was very concerned. She thought someone was threatening us and even wanted to call the police. And whenever she mentioned calling the police, I had to tell her, like, hey, that was just my friends. We play this game with each other. You don't need to worry about this. And she was not very happy. She couldn't believe I would do something like this, and it was so out of character for me. But in this instance, I was like the youngest child who maybe pushes the limits on what you necessarily should be doing. Right now, you may be wondering, why have I been up here talking about all these silly random stories from my life? And I promise that no matter how silly or random they seem, each of these stories has a purpose. They demonstrate a different part of who I am. In my thesis, I researched how we are the way we are and the family's influence on that question. Researchers and psychologists have been trying to figure this out for decades. It's a big question of why we are the way we are and how we are the way we are. And in my own experience, after hours and hours of researching and writing, I understand why we haven't really found one answer to this question, because it's so much bigger than any one person could fully understand. But what I did learn is that there are a lot of different aspects that lead to who we are and who we're becoming. So as we experience new things, we change and we grow. And sometimes these changes can be life-altering, and others, they might be so small we never notice. But they're there. We all are constantly changing and adapting who we are depending on different factors in our environment. So this can explain why sometimes I might be reliable and dependable, and others I might need to be around a reliable, dependable person. There's not one easy way to say what or who I am, and no personality test or theory will be able to pinpoint that. So while the OCEAN acronym and birth order theories are both really interesting and they can be insightful if we use them in the right way, if we only look at ourselves through these narrow lenses, we can really oversimplify who we are. We as people, and especially most of us teenagers, have the tendency to oversimplify things. We like to find the easiest way to get all of our solutions. And while in math it might not be the biggest deal to oversimplify how an equation works, maybe you miss a few steps and not write something down, in our real lives, whenever we oversimplify ourselves and others, it can become problematic. By attempting to fit into a single group or a single role, you're limiting yourself and your opportunities, and basically trapping yourself in a little box. And not only do we do this to ourselves, we do this to other people as well. By judging and categorizing others, we can fail to see the full, complete, and complex person that they really are. A day like launch is the perfect day to start thinking about this. And I want to challenge all of you today to be aware of yourself and others around you. Start to think about who are they, how are y'all different, and most importantly, what can we all learn from each other? Going back to my question, who are you? My answer is, it's complicated. We all are.